Imagine being a woman in 1271. What if your very breath, your every move, was dictated not just by official decrees, but by the quiet whispers of your neighbors, the unwritten rules of your village? What if the biggest barriers to your freedom weren't found in royal charters, but in the ingrained customs of your daily life? Number 15, the absent smile at the village green. Life in 1271 was incredibly physical. People worked with their hands, lived outdoors much of the time, and recreation often involved vigorous activity. Think of the village green, the heart of community life. Here, young men might wrestle, practice with staves, or play boisterous ball games. They'd gather for archery contests, their laughter echoing across the fields, but where were the women? While certainly present, observing the lively scene, their participation in such physical recreational activities was often curtailed by unwritten social custom, not by any formal law. There was no royal decree stating that women could not run races or participate in a game of football, yet the sight of a woman joining such pursuits would likely have drawn gasps of shock and whispers of impropriety. Consider a sunny afternoon in a village like Chilham in Kent. Young men are kicking a leather ball around, their shouts of excitement filling the air. Ilara, a spirited 16-year-old, watches from the edge, a longing in her eyes. She's strong from working in the fields and herding the sheep, and her agile mind quickly understands the game's flow. She might even be able to outmaneuver some of the clumsy boys. But if she were to step onto the green, her simple linen gown immediately out of place in the rough and tumble sport, the reactions would be swift and critical. The other women would shake their heads, clucking about her lack of decorum. The men, initially stunned, might mock her, or worse, see her as a challenge to their masculine domain. Father, a sensible farmer, would likely pull her aside later, a look of disappointment on his face, explaining that such behavior was not for a girl destined for marriage and a respectable household. This wasn't just about sports, it extended to other forms of leisure too. While singing, dancing, and storytelling were communal, women's participation often had a more confined role. They might sing ballads while spinning wool or tell tales by the hearth, but rarely would they lead a public revelry or a boisterous tavern song session. Even the simple act of visiting a local inn for purely social reasons, without a male escort, could be seen as questionable for a woman, particularly if she was unmarried. The expectation was that women's leisure time, if it existed beyond endless chores, would be centered around the home, the family, or quiet, chaperoned gatherings with other women. Their smiles and laughter were expected to be present, but within the bounds of what custom deemed appropriate, often making them absent from the most outwardly joyful and unrestrained public gatherings. This silent exclusion from certain types of recreation was a powerful, though unwritten, way of reinforcing gender roles, keeping women's lives more controlled and their public presence more subdued. It was a custom that subtly, yet effectively, limited their freedom to simply enjoy themselves in the same open, uninhibited ways as men. Number 14, the widowed path and the pressure to conform. In 1271, formal law often granted widows a surprisingly strong position, particularly regarding property. A widow was usually entitled to a dower, typically 1/3 of her deceased husband's land, for her lifetime. She could even, in some cases, inherit her husband's personal goods. Legally, she was often free to choose whether or not to remarry, and to whom. However, local customs often wove a complex web of expectations and pressures that could override these legal rights, pushing widows onto a path far narrower than the law allowed. These customs dictated how widows were expected to behave, how they should manage their property, and even whether they should consider marrying again. Imagine Agnes, a widow in the village of Aldworth, Berkshire. Her husband, Thomas, a tenant farmer, died suddenly, leaving her with 2 young children and a small holding. By law, Agnes was entitled to her dower. But immediately, the unspoken rules of the community began to assert themselves. Her late husband's family, particularly his brothers, might begin to exert pressure. They might suggest that she should marry one of them to keep the land and the children within the family name. This wasn't a legal demand, but a social expectation, reinforced by the belief that a woman alone might struggle to manage the farm or provide for her children adequately. Agnes had a daughter. The pressure might be even greater, as the family would want to ensure the daughter's future marriage upheld their status. Furthermore, a widow's independence, even if legally granted, could be viewed with suspicion. Agnes chose not to remarry. She might be seen as an anomaly, perhaps even a threat to the established social order. Her decisions about her land, whether to farm it herself, lease it out, or sell it, would be scrutinized by neighbors and the manor lord. While she had legal rights, custom often held that a woman needed a man to truly manage property, and that her land should ultimately pass to a male heir. Should Agnes consider marrying someone from outside the village, or someone of a lower social standing, the community's disapproval could be immense. This wasn't about legal prohibitions, but about the social weight of custom. People might avoid her, gossip about her choices, or even subtly undermine her efforts to farm if she chose to do so independently. There were also customary financial pressure. In some manors, a widow might have to pay a heriot, a best beast or chattel, to the lord upon her husband's death, or a fine to retain her dower land. While these were formal obligations, the interpretation and enforcement could be influenced by local custom. The lord might, for instance, be customarily more lenient on a widow who quickly remarried someone acceptable to him, or more demanding of one who seemed to defy convention. Pressure to conform was immense, shaping Agnes's choices far more powerfully than any written law. Her legal right to choose her path was always there, but the narrow, shadowed path of local custom often forced her onto a different, more restrictive journey. Number 13, the shared field and the closed gate. The medieval landscape was a mosaic of common lands, pastures for grazing animals, woods for collecting firewood and timber, and open fields where villagers shared plowing and harvesting duties. These common resources were vital for survival, particularly for the poorer members of society. While formal law and manorial custom often dictated who had rights to these lands, the actual access and use by women were frequently limited by unwritten local customs. General assumption was that access to these resources was granted to male heads of households, and women, even if technically part of that household, often found their personal direct access to be restricted or indirect. Consider the common pasture outside the village of Sherborne, Dorset. Every villager with rights could graze their animals there. For a male farmer, this meant taking his cows or sheep out, supervising them, and bringing them back. For his wife, Alara, her access to this common land was tied to her husband's status. If he was away, sick, or simply chose not to use the common, she would not easily be able to assert her own right to take their single goat or cow to graze. It was simply not the custom for women to manage the larger, more communal aspects of animal husbandry in this way. While she might take smaller animals to graze on less formal edges of the common, or collect gleanings after harvest, her freedom to fully utilize the common pasture was constrained. Then there were the woods. Gathering firewood was a daily chore for women, essential for cooking and warmth. But local customs often dictated where and when women could gather wood, and what kind. While men might be permitted to fell trees for building or larger timbers, women were generally restricted to collecting deadwood or fallen branches. They might be able to gather nuts or berries, but their access was often tied to the perceived, lighter tasks, while the heavier, more lucrative aspects of woodland use were reserved for men. The concept was not a formal legal ban on women entering the woods, but a custom that implicitly defined their role and the scope of their activities within these shared spaces. Even access to water, from a communal well or stream, could have subtle customary restrictions. While women were the primary water carriers, the act of drawing water, or the social interactions around the well, might be governed by unwritten rules about propriety and social hierarchy. A woman from a lower social standing might be expected to wait for those of higher status, or avoid certain times of day. These weren't laws, but the quiet, persistent pressure of custom. These unwritten rules about common lands and resources, often subtle and rarely challenged, formed an invisible barrier, ensuring that women's lives remained tethered to the household and limited in their ability to independently harness vital community assets. The shared field, while seemingly open, often had an invisible, closed gate for women, requiring a male key to pass through fully. Number 12, the solitary chamber of childbirth. In 1271, formal law had little to say about the intimate details of childbirth. It was a private matter, deeply rooted in custom, superstition, and the practicalities of a world without modern medicine. While legal rights for women were often tied to marriage and inheritance, the customs surrounding childbirth placed immense, often dangerous, restrictions on a woman's life during her most vulnerable moments. These restrictions weren't written decrees, but ingrained community expectations and beliefs that dictated who could be present, what rituals must be performed, and even where a woman was expected to give birth. Imagine Alina, a young woman in the village of Castle Acre, Norfolk, in the throes of labor. Her first child is coming. While formal law might grant her certain property rights later in life, right now, her life is entirely dictated by unwritten customs. The first and most profound custom was the exclusion of men. Childbirth was almost exclusively a female domain. Men, including the husband, were generally not allowed in the birthing chamber. This custom, while perhaps intended to protect the woman's modesty or the man from witnessing a traumatic event, also meant that medical knowledge and assistance were limited to what other women could provide. Complications arose. The absence of men, who might have access to different forms of knowledge or be able to fetch assistance from further afield, could be devastating. The birthing chamber itself was often made a place of ritual and superstition. Women would draw curtains, light candles, and sometimes place specific herbs or charms to ward off evil spirits and ensure a safe delivery. These weren't church laws, but local customs passed down through generations. While a skilled midwife, usually an older woman from the village, would be present, her methods were often a mix of practical experience and customary beliefs. She might administer traditional remedies, some helpful, others potentially harmful, based on what her mother and grandmother had taught her, not on any formal medical training. Furthermore, custom often dictated a period of lying in after childbirth, where the new mother was confined to her bed for a set number of days or weeks, often 40. This was partly for recovery, but also steeped in religious and social custom related to purification after childbirth. While beneficial for rest, it also served as a profound social isolation. During this time, the woman might be prohibited from attending church, visiting neighbors, or even receiving certain visitors. Her world shrunk to the confines of her birthing chamber. This was not a legal imprisonment, but a customary one, reinforced by social expectation and the belief that such rituals were necessary for her health and spiritual well-being. It was a time of both profound vulnerability and profound customary restriction, where the most intimate and vital event in a woman's life was entirely governed by the unwritten rules of her community. Number 11, the tamed tongue in public spaces. In the year 1271, a woman's public behavior, particularly her speech, was subjected to a myriad of unwritten customs that went far beyond any formal legal statute. While there might be laws against slander or public disturbance that applied to everyone, the societal expectations for women were far more restrictive, demanding a tamed tongue in public spaces. This meant that women were expected to be demure, quiet, and deferential, especially when interacting with men or those of higher social standing. Breaking these unwritten rules could lead to severe social penalties, far more impactful than a fine from the manor court. Imagine Evelina, a young woman from the village of Coggeshall, Essex, accompanying her father to the local market. The market square is a cacophony of sounds, the calls of vendors, the haggling of buyers, the clatter of carts. Evelina has a sharp wit and often expresses her opinions freely within the safety of her family home, but at the market, her demeanor changes. She walks with her eyes downcast, speaking only when spoken to, and then in a soft, low voice. Should she speak too loudly, laugh too boisterously, or engage in a spirited argument with a male vendor, the consequences would not be a legal summons, but a torrent of social disapproval. Other women might give her disapproving glances, men might make crude jokes at her expense, and her own father might later chastise her for bringing shame upon the family. This custom extended to various public settings. In the church, women were expected to be silent and attentive, often seated separately from men. In the manorial court, if a woman was a witness or a litigant, her testimony might be viewed with skepticism if she spoke too forcefully or seemed too assertive. Her male relative, if present, was often expected to speak for her or at least guide her testimony. It was a common customary belief that women were more emotional and less rational, and therefore their words in public should be carefully measured and controlled. Even seemingly innocent interactions were governed by these unwritten rules. A woman should not interrupt a man, especially an older or higher status man. She should not offer unsolicited advice or opinions in public gatherings. Her role was to listen, to agree, or to express herself indirectly. The scold's bridle or brank was a real physical punishment in some towns for women deemed too loud or quarrelsome, but it was often applied based on local custom and community complaint, not a universal legal code. Fear of being branded a scold or a gossip was a powerful deterrent, forcing women to internalize these restrictions on their speech. Thus, the absence of a loud voice, the controlled laugh, and the deferential silence were not merely good manners, but vital strategies for survival and respectability in the public spaces of medieval England. Tamed tongue was a custom that significantly limited a woman's public presence and agency. Number 10. The unspoken rules of adornment. In 1271, while some formal sumptuary laws existed, these usually applied to the nobility and the very wealthy, dictating who could wear certain expensive materials or color. For the vast majority of women, what they wore was not dictated by royal decree, but by a complex web of unspoken local customs that governed modesty, marital status, social standing, and general propriety. These were the unspoken rules of adornment, enforced not by legal fines, but by the powerful, pervasive judgment of the community. Deviate from these customs was to invite gossip, suspicion, and a loss of reputation, which could be far more damaging than any legal penalty. Consider Aliana, a young, unmarried woman in the village of Eynesbury, Huntingdonshire. Her daily attire would be simple: a long tunic or kirtle, perhaps an apron, and a wimple or head covering that concealed her hair. This wasn't a law, but a deeply ingrained custom. For an unmarried woman to expose her hair, especially in public, was considered immodest and a sign of loose moral. It implied that she was not respectable, perhaps even seeking male attention in an inappropriate way. While no court would fine her for an uncovered head, she might find herself ostracized, whispered about at the well, and her prospects for a respectable marriage severely harmed. No decent family would want a daughter-in-law who flaunted custom in such a way. Custom also dictated how women dressed according to their marital status. Once married, a woman would typically wear a more substantial head covering, perhaps a veil, signifying her new status and respectable position within the community. For a married woman to dress in a manner perceived as too revealing, or in colors too bright or showy for her station, would be considered a breach of customary conduct. It might suggest she was trying to attract other men, or that she was neglecting her domestic duties in favor of vanity. These subtle visual cues were critical in communicating a woman's place in society and her adherence to its unwritten rule. Furthermore, the quality and type of clothing reflected one's social standing. While sumptuary laws might target the wealthy, local customs ensured that a peasant woman would not attempt to dress like a merchant's wife, let alone a noblewoman. The materials she wore, the simplicity of her design, and the absence of decorative elements were all signals of her place. Try and dress above her station would not only be impractical due to cost, but would also invite ridicule and accusations of pretentiousness. The unspoken rules of adornment were thus a powerful tool of social control, reinforcing hierarchy, gender roles, and community expectations. They turned every gown, every head covering, and every accessory into a statement, a silent language that women were compelled to speak correctly, lest they face the harsh, unyielding judgment of their neighbors. Number 9. The cloistered heart of devotion. In 1271, religious life was central to daily existence, deeply interwoven with social custom. While formal church law mandated attendance at Mass and prescribed certain rituals for all believers, the actual practice of women's devotion, particularly in public spaces, was significantly shaped by unwritten local customs. These customs often pushed women towards a cloistered heart of devotion, encouraging private piety and limiting their public roles within the church, even though they were fervent believers and integral to the spiritual life of the community. Imagine a leaner, a devout woman from the bustling market town of Stamford, Lincolnshire. On a Sunday morning, she would attend Mass at the parish church. While men and women gathered under one roof, custom often dictated their physical separation. Women would sit on one side of the nave, men on the other, or women might be relegated to the back. This wasn't a universal church law, but a common local custom, rooted in ideas of propriety and order. This separation, while seemingly benign, subtly reinforced the idea that women's public presence, even in worship, should be contained and orderly. Beyond seating, women's participation in the liturgy was limited by custom. Could not serve as priests, of course, but nor could they typically serve in lesser roles like altar servers, readers, or church wardens. While wealthy women might commission chantries or contribute greatly to church funds, their involvement was usually through patronage, not active participation in the public rituals. Their voices might join the hymns, but they would not lead the prayers or readings. Their devotion was expressed through quiet contemplation, personal prayer, and attendance at services, rather than active leadership or public demonstration of piety. Furthermore, certain forms of public religious expression were discouraged or restricted for women by custom. While men might go on pilgrimages relatively freely, a woman, especially an unmarried one, doing so alone would raise questions of impropriety and safety. If she did undertake a pilgrimage, she would ideally travel with family or a trusted group. Women's religious lives were often channeled into more private forms of devotion, reciting prayers at home, tending to domestic shrines, or perhaps joining women's prayer groups or confraternities, though these too had their own customary rules. For women who felt a deep spiritual calling, the options were often limited to entering a convent, where their devotion could be cloistered and their public presence strictly controlled. Thus, while women were seen as inherently pious and spiritually significant, local customs placed a quiet but firm hand on the reins of their public devotion, ensuring their religious fervor was expressed within the established, often private, boundaries of their community. Number 8. The lessons of the spinning wheel and the hearth. For girls in 1271, education was not a formal, institutionalized system for the vast majority. It was instead a practical apprenticeship into the roles they would assume as women. While boys, especially those from more privileged families, might learn to read, write, or study Latin, girls were primarily educated in the lessons of the spinning wheel and the hearth. This wasn't because formal law forbade girls from learning to read. Indeed, some noblewomen were highly literate, but because local custom and societal expectations profoundly shaped the priorities of their upbringing, steering them away from scholarly pursuits and firmly towards domestic skills. Imagine Lyra, a young girl growing up in a peasant family in the village of Great Shelford, Cambridgeshire. From an early age, her grandmother and mother began her education. She would learn how to tend the fire, fetch water, and prepare simple meals. By the time she was 7 or 8, her hands would be busy with wool, learning to card, spin, and perhaps even weave simple lengths for clothing. She'd learn to mend, to sew, to care for younger siblings, and to tend to the small garden plots. These were not just chores, they were her essential schooling, equipping her with the skills necessary to manage a household, feed a family, and contribute to the economic well-being of her future husband's home. The lessons at the spinning wheel and the hearth were paramount because custom dictated that a woman's primary purpose was to be a wife and mother, a manager of the domestic sphere. Literacy, while useful for merchants or clergy, was generally not considered essential for this role. For a girl like Lyra, spending time learning to read or write would be seen as frivolous, even detrimental, taking away precious hours that could be spent mastering practical, indispensable skills. Parents would worry that such pursuits might make her less appealing as a wife, less capable of managing a farm or a household. They certainly wouldn't send her to the local monastery to learn to read, even if a kindly monk were willing. Even for girls from slightly higher social strata, perhaps daughters of prosperous merchants or craftsmen, their education would still heavily emphasize household management, account keeping for the family business, and piety rather than broad academic studies. While they might learn basic literacy for managing household accounts or reading devotional texts, extensive scholarship or learning languages was rare and often confined to the cloister for a privileged few. Powerful custom that defined a woman's worth by her domestic capabilities and her ability to sustain a household meant that the lessons of the spinning wheel and the hearth became the only curriculum available to most girls, silently but effectively closing the door to other forms of knowledge and intellectual development. Number 7. The silent bench in the manorial court. In 1271, the manorial court was the bedrock of local justice, settling disputes, enforcing labor services, and administering the daily affairs of the village. While women could appear in these courts as plaintiffs, defendants, or even witnesses, particularly in cases involving property, debt, or personal injury, their effective voice and agency were profoundly limited by unwritten local customs. These customs often relegated women to a silent bench, where their testimony was heard, but their ability to articulate their case, challenge assumptions, or command respect was severely hampered, primarily by the expectation that a man would speak on their behalf. Imagine Isabella, a woman from the village of Elton, Cambridgeshire, who has a dispute with her neighbor over damage caused by his pigs to her small garden. She appears before the manorial court, presided over by the Lord Steward. While she has a legal right to bring her complaint, the moment she steps forward, custom begins to apply its pressure. She is expected to be respectful, demure, and brief. Her voice, if she speaks at all, should be soft and deferential. Custom dictated that a woman should not speak boldly or eloquently in such a formal, male-dominated setting. Crucially, it was a deeply ingrained custom for women to have a male relative or a legal representative speak for them. If Isabella's husband were alive, he would present her case. If she were a widow, her son, brother, or even a male neighbor might be expected to act as her voice in court. Even if she possessed keen intelligence and a strong grasp of the facts, custom dictated that a man would translate her grievances into the language of the court, a language she might understand, but was not customarily permitted to speak directly with authority. Isabella attempted to passionately argue her own case, or to challenge the steward's rulings. She would likely be seen as unruly, impertinent, or even irrational. Her words might be dismissed, and her claim potentially undermined by her perceived lack of proper conduct. Furthermore, the weight given to a woman's testimony could be influenced by custom. While sworn oaths were legally binding, a woman's oath might be viewed with more skepticism than a man's, especially in cases of reputation or moral conduct. Accusations of slander, for instance, might be taken less seriously if the woman spoke too freely about them. The very act of appearing in court was often considered a regrettable necessity for women, and their presence there was expected to be as brief and unobtrusive as possible. The silent bench was not a physical place, but a metaphorical one, representing the customary suppression of women's independent voice and agency within the formal structures of local justice, forcing them to rely on male intermediaries even when their rights were legally at stake. Number 6. The invisible chains of travel. In 1271, there was no formal law that explicitly prohibited women from traveling. Indeed, women undertook journeys for various reasons: visiting family, going on pilgrimages, traveling to markets, or accompanying their husbands. However, local customs wove an invisible net of restrictions around women's mobility, particularly for unmarried or unescorted women. These unwritten rules were centered around concepts of propriety, safety, and reputation, creating invisible chains that severely limited their freedom of movement far beyond any legal statutes. Travel alone, especially for an unmarried woman, was to invite suspicion, gossip, and potential danger. Imagine Alice, a young, unmarried woman from a village near Winchester, Hampshire. Her elderly aunt in a neighboring village has fallen ill, and Alice feels a duty to visit her. Distance is only a few miles, a journey a young man might undertake without a second thought. For Alice, it is a fraught decision. Custom dictates that a respectable unmarried woman does not travel alone. She would be seen as vulnerable, an easy target for robbers or worse. More subtly, her mere presence alone on the road might raise questions about her virtue. Why was she not with her family? Was she fleeing something? Was she seeking illicit encounter? Alice attempted the journey alone. She might encounter suspicion from villagers she passed, or even from the local authorities. There was no law against walking on a public road, but the custom of the time suggested that women should always be chaperoned, ideally by a male relative, or at least by a group of trusted women. The mere act of solitary travel could damage her reputation, making it difficult for her to find a respectable husband or to regain the trust of her community upon her return. People might whisper that she was a vagabond, a loose woman, or worse. Even for married women, solo travel could be challenging. While they had more customary leeway than unmarried women, a long journey without a husband or a reputable escort might still be viewed with raised eyebrows. Their freedom was often tied to their husband's permission or the explicit purpose of the journey, such as selling goods at a specific market. Pilgrimage, a common reason for travel, was often undertaken in large groups specifically to provide safety and respectability for women. Fear of being seen as unprotected or improper was a powerful deterrent. Thus, while no formal chain bound a woman to her village, the invisible chains of custom, the pervasive fear of damage to her reputation, and the very real dangers of the road for an unescorted woman, effectively confined the majority of women to a much smaller geographical sphere than men, making long-distance, independent travel a rarity rather than a right. Number 5. The barred door of the guild hall. In the bustling towns and cities of 1271, economic life was increasingly organized around guilds. These were powerful associations of craftsmen or merchants, regulating trade, setting prices, and controlling who could practice a particular craft. While women certainly played a vital role in the urban economy, brewing ale, baking bread, spinning wool, and assisting in family trades, their access to full membership within these guilds, and thus to independent economic power, was often severely restricted by local custom, more than by formal law. The barred door of the guild hall represented a significant barrier to women's economic independence and social mobility. Consider a leaner, a skilled weaver in the town of Lincoln. She works tirelessly, perhaps even more skillfully than some men. She helps her husband produce lengths of woolen cloth that are sold far and wide. By law, she is a free person, capable of entering contracts. However, when it comes to joining the Weavers' Guild, the unwritten rules come into play. While some guilds, particularly those in less prestigious trades like brewing or silk production, might admit women, the more powerful and lucrative guilds often barred them from full membership. This wasn't always a written rule in the guild's charter, but a deeply ingrained custom. Guild was a brotherhood, a male domain, designed to protect the interests of its male members. As a result, a leaner could not become a master weaver in her own right, even if she had the skill and capital. She could not apprentice other women, or, more importantly, have an independent voice in setting trade standards or controlling the market. Economic activity was often considered an extension of her husband's or father's business. If her husband died, she might be allowed to continue the trade as a widow, but often only for a limited period or under specific conditions, and rarely with the same authority as a male master. The assumption was that a woman, while capable of practical work, was not suitable for the administrative and leadership roles within the guild. This customary exclusion had profound consequences. It limited women's ability to accumulate wealth independently, to train apprentices freely, or to rise in social standing through their own enterprise. It confined them to supporting roles, or to trades that were less regulated and often less profitable. While women certainly worked hard and contributed immensely to their families' livelihoods, the barred door of the guild hall, enforced by custom rather than explicit law, kept them from wielding the full economic power and influence that men could attain through these crucial medieval institutions. It was a silent, yet powerful, custom that ensured women's economic activities remained largely within the shadow of male control. Number 4. The whispering web of reputation. In 1271, a woman's reputation was arguably her most valuable asset, far more fragile and more easily lost than any material possession. While formal law dealt with serious crimes like theft or assault, the intricate whispering web of reputation was a local custom, an unwritten code of conduct enforced by community gossip, suspicion, and ostracization. Accusations of ill repute, particularly concerning sexual morality or general behavior, could destroy a woman's life without a single legal charge being laid against her. This customary control was pervasive and incredibly powerful, forcing women to live meticulously within societal expectations. Imagine Isabella, a spirited young woman in the village of Pershore, Worcestershire. One evening she is seen speaking alone with a young man she is not related to, for a little too long, perhaps even laughing a little too loudly. There is no law against this. She has committed no crime. But the next day the whispers begin. Mrs. Alina at the well might mention it to Mrs. Agnes. Soon, the story might grow, becoming exaggerated. Isabella might be described as forward, too bold, or even unclean. These whispers, like threads in a web, spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Consequences for Isabella, though not legal, could be devastating. Her marriage prospects, her most crucial pathway to security and status in medieval society, would be severely damaged. Prospective suitors and their families would hear the rumors and choose a bride with an unblemished reputation. If she were already married, such whispers could strain her relationship with her husband, who might face public shame and pressure from his own family. She might be subtly excluded from social gatherings, left out of women's work groups, or even face open scorn in the marketplace. This customary enforcement of reputation extended beyond sexual conduct. A woman who was perceived as lazy, quarrelsome, or disrespectful of authority could also find herself caught in the whispering web. If she failed to perform her expected duties as a wife or daughter, or if she spoke out of turn in public, the community's disapproval would be swift and unofficial. The scold's bridle, while a physical punishment, was often a customary response to repeated gossiping or scolding behavior, applied by local authorities based on community complaints rather than national law. Fear of being ensnared in this web, of losing one's good name, was a constant pressure on women in 1271. It compelled them to conform, to be perpetually mindful of their appearance, their words, and their actions, lest the silent, powerful judgment of their neighbors irrevocably condemn them without trial. Number 3, the unseen knot of marriage consent. In 1271, formal church law, which held significant sway, technically stipulated that a marriage required the free consent of both parties. This meant a woman could not legally be forced into marriage. However, this legal principle often collided with a powerful, deeply entrenched local custom, the expectation that a woman's marriage would serve her family's interests, and that her consent would be shaped, if not entirely dictated, by their will. This created an unseen knot, binding women to unions chosen by others, despite legal provisions for individual choice. Imagine Alara, a 15-year-old girl from a prosperous peasant family in the village of Cogges, Oxfordshire. A suitable suitor, a young man from a neighboring village with good land, has been proposed by her father. Alara might have her own secret preferences, perhaps a young man she has known since childhood, but her family's interests are paramount. Her father sees the proposed match as a way to consolidate land, form alliances, or improve the family's social standing. There is no legal document forcing Alara to marry. Instead, the pressure is exerted through powerful customary means. Parents might invoke the honor of the family, the necessity of the match for their future security, or even religious duty. They might remind her of the burden she would place on them if she refused, or paint a bleak picture of spinsterhood, which custom dictated was a less desirable path for women. The community itself would reinforce this pressure. Neighbors would laud the good match her parents had made, offering congratulations and advice that subtly undermined any thought of refusal. To refuse such a match, particularly a good one, would be seen as disobedient, ungrateful, or even foolish. It would bring shame upon her family and potentially jeopardize their standing in the village. While Alara could technically utter the words, "I do not consent," before a priest, the social and emotional cost of doing so would be immense. She might face ostracization, parental disapproval that could lead to disinheritance, or simply a future of bleak isolation. Choices were often reduced to a simple, binary one: accept the match her family had chosen, or face the crushing weight of customary disapproval and a lonely future. This custom was not a formal legal prohibition against refusal, but a powerful social mechanism that ensured most women, especially those without independent means, felt compelled to accept unions that served their family's agenda. Unseen knot of customary obligation was often far stronger than any legal right to consent, shaping their destinies from the earliest stages of their lives. Number 2, the hidden hand of inheritance for daughters. In 1271, formal law concerning inheritance, particularly of land, largely favored male heirs through primogeniture, the eldest son inheriting all. However, beyond codified laws, a subtle but pervasive local custom, the hidden hand of inheritance further restricted daughters' access to property and wealth. While daughters might legally be entitled to a share of movable goods, personal property like livestock, tools, household items, or a dower from land upon widowhood, local custom often ensured that the bulk of family wealth remained within the male lineage, or was granted to daughters under specific, restrictive conditions. Imagine Catherine, a daughter in a family of prosperous freemen in the village of Elton, Derbyshire. Father dies without a son, leaving behind a substantial amount of movable goods and perhaps some customary land. By law, Catherine and her sisters might be entitled to an equal share of the movable goods with their mother. However, local custom often dictated that the most valuable items, especially those related to the family trade or farming implements, should be kept intact and preferably passed to a male relative, even a distant one. Hidden hand ensured that while she received something, it might not be a proportional share or the most valuable assets. Furthermore, any land inheritance for a daughter was precarious. Land was held by customary tenure, like copyhold local custom, sometimes allowed daughters to inherit equally in the absence of sons, a practice known as partible inheritance. However, this was not universal. More often, the custom might dictate that the land would pass to a male cousin, or that a daughter's right was contingent on her marrying a man approved by the lord or family, effectively transferring control to her husband. Even if she inherited land, the custom often viewed it as her husband's land through her, rather than hers outright. She might not have the customary authority to sell or manage it without his consent, or even if he were gone, without the agreement of the male relatives. This hidden hand also manifested in the form of a dowry or marriage portion. While this was a payment or gift from a bride's family to her new husband's family upon marriage, it was less about ensuring her independent wealth and more about making her an attractive prospect for a good marriage. It was often her only inheritance, given to her upon leaving her natal home. Family would thus consider her provided for through marriage, and therefore no longer entitled to further inheritance from her parents' estate. This custom ensured that daughters received their share not as independent property, but as a transaction that moved them from their father's household to their husband's, often with the underlying expectation that the wealth would ultimately benefit her husband and their sons. Hidden hand of custom silently guided family wealth away from daughters, ensuring it continued its journey down the male lineage, restricting women's independent economic power despite any legal loopholes. Number 1. The widow's weeds and loss of control over dowry. In 1271, a widow legally had a significant right, her dower. This was typically 1/3 of her deceased husband's land, which she held for the remainder of her life. This was meant to provide her with an income and a place to live. However, the widow's weeds, both the literal black garments and the metaphorical burden of a specific social role, often came with customary restrictions that chipped away at her actual control over this vital property, going far beyond formal legal limitations. While she had the right to the income, her freedom to manage or dispose of her dower land was often severely curtailed by unwritten community expectations and the lingering influence of her late husband's family. Consider Beatrice, a widow in the village of Ramsey, Huntingdonshire. Her husband John has died, leaving her with her dower land. Legally, she is entitled to the profits from this land, but immediately, customs begin to exert their pressure. Her late husband's family, particularly his brothers or adult sons from a previous marriage, might customarily expect to advise her on how to manage the land. This advice often bordered on control. They might suggest which crops to plant, which tenants to lease to, or even demand certain traditional payments or services from the land that might not be legally required, but were customary within the family or manor. Furthermore, while Beatrice technically had the right to her dower for life, local custom often viewed it as land that would eventually revert to her husband's heirs. This meant that she might be subtly or overtly discouraged from making any decisions that would permanently alter the land, like selling parts of it or building new structures, even if such actions might improve her current income or living conditions. Community influenced by these customs would support the family's expectations, seeing her as a temporary custodian rather than a full owner. Any attempt to act independently could be met with disapproval, a loss of good standing, or even accusations of mismanaging her late husband's legacy. Perhaps the most significant customary restriction was regarding remarriage. While legally free to remarry, remarrying often meant forfeiting her dower. This was sometimes a formal legal condition in the terms of the dower, but often it was a powerful customary expectation. Her late husband's family, who saw the dower as their ultimate inheritance, would customarily pressure her not to remarry, or at least to marry someone they approved of, or to give up her dower voluntarily upon a second marriage. This custom meant that a widow's independence was often a solitary state. She could have property and autonomy, but only at the cost of foregoing the social and economic benefits of a new marriage. The widow's weeds thus symbolized not just mourning, but a particular set of customary restrictions that, despite her legal entitlements, often left her with less actual control over her life and property than formal law might suggest. Her dower, while a right, was often a possession with invisible strings, pulled by the hands of custom and community expectation.